He only asked for a roof for one night, but the Apache giant, a creature of legend and solitude, froze when a long-forgotten desire struck him down. The desert stretched endlessly, a sea of gold and ochre under the dying light of the sun. Heat shimmered off the sand, bending reality into mirages that whispered of water where none existed. A lone traveler trudged through this barren expanse, his cloak tattered and streaked with dust, boots scuffed and blistered. His eyes, hollowed by days without food or proper rest, scanned the horizon desperately, seeking even the smallest hint of shelter. He had not come here for adventure or glory, only a roof, even for a single night. His journey had been long and weary, a relentless trek across unforgiving lands, driven by need rather than desire. Each step felt heavier than the last, not just from the weight of his pack, but from the invisible burden of isolation. A storm was brewing on the edge of the sky-dark clouds, curling like restless spirits. Wind beginning to stir the sand, and the traveler knew time was slipping away. In the distance, faint against the dimming light, he saw a shape. At first, he thought it a cluster of rocks, the kind that seemed to sprout unpredictably from the desert floor. But as he drew closer, he realized it was no natural formation. Towering above the sand was the figure of a man or something far larger than a man. The shoulders spanned the width of small caravans, and his presence seemed to press down on the earth itself, bending shadows unnaturally. Even in the fading light, his skin seemed to glimmer faintly, like bronze kissed by sunlight, muscles taut beneath the surface as though carved from stone. The traveler's heart raced. Legends of the Apache giant were whispered among desert tribes, tales of a solitary guardian, a creature of immense strength and fierce pride, who had not spoken to a human for decades, yet he had no choice. He swallowed his fear, remembering the storm approaching, the unrelenting chill that night would bring. With a trembling voice he called out, "Please, I only need a roof for one night." The figure moved, slowly, with a grace that belied his size. Each step caused the sand to quake slightly, as though the desert itself acknowledged his presence. The traveler felt the air thicken around him, the oppressive weight of something ancient and powerful pressing into his chest. The giant stopped, towering above him, arms crossed like the walls of a fortress. Silence stretched, long and unyielding, broken only by the soft hiss of wind over sand. Then, unexpectedly, the giant spoke. His voice was deep, resonant, echoing against the distant dunes like the tolling of a bell. "Why should I shelter you?" he asked. There was no malice, but an ancient caution, a careful measuring of the traveler's worth. The question itself seemed to demand more than an answer. It demanded trust, courage, and humility. The traveler, trembling but resolute, lowered his eyes and said honestly, "Because I have nowhere else to go. Because the storm is coming, and because I do not ask for more than a single night." His words were simple, but in them was the weight of desperation, the truth that he carried in every line of his face and every ache in his limbs. For a long moment, the giant said nothing. He seemed to consider the human before him, weighing the small, fragile creature against the vastness of the desert, against his own centuries of solitude. The traveler dared not move, not even to breathe too loudly. He felt the enormity of the moment, the thin line between life and peril, hospitality and indifference. Finally, the giant stepped aside, a motion slow and deliberate. The traveler caught his first true glimpse of the shelter, a cavern carved into the base of a cliff, large enough to house not just a man, but 100. The interior glimmered faintly with the light of unknown fires, shadows dancing along walls etched with symbols, relics, and bones of creatures long past. It was at once terrifying and wondrous. "Come inside," the giant said. His tone held no warmth, yet there was acceptance, a quiet acknowledgment of need. One night, The traveler exhaled a breath he hadn't realized he was holding, stepping cautiously into the cavern. Outside, the first drops of the storm began to fall, cool against the searing heat of the desert. Inside, he found himself surrounded by the echoes of the giant's life, a mixture of silence, shadow, and the faintest trace of longing. For the first time, he realized that he was not merely seeking shelter from the storm, but that he had entered the threshold of something far older, far stranger, and far more dangerous than any desert he had crossed. He only asked for a roof for one night, but the night itself felt like it had already begun shaping the course of fate, bending both traveler and giant toward an unknown destiny. The cavern swallowed the traveler in darkness, but it was a darkness alive with movement. Shadows clung to the walls as if the stones themselves breathed, shifting with every flicker of the giant's unseen fire. The traveler's heart hammered in his chest, each beat echoing unnaturally in the vast chamber. The air was heavy with the scent of earth and smoke, mingled with something unplaceable, something ancient. Like the memory of storms long past, he took cautious steps, his boots scraping softly against the stone floor. Every movement was amplified in the cavern, and every creak of rock seemed to announce his intrusion. And yet, through it all, the giant was silent. He did not speak, did not move, and did not beckon. The traveler felt as though he were being measured, not by the strength of his body, but by the fragile, trembling weight of his soul. Finally, the giant emerged from the deeper shadows, his colossal form blocking the faint light of the fire. The traveler could see the scale of him now, shoulders wider than a cart, arms like bent tree trunks, hands that could crush stone with ease. Yet despite the sheer terror he inspired, the giant's face was strangely human. High cheekbones, eyes that held a storm of emotion, and a faint crease in his brow that hinted at centuries of thought. The traveler, for a moment, could see not just a monster, but a being who had once known curiosity, fear, and perhaps even loneliness. The giant's voice rumbled, low and deliberate. "You are far from home, little one. Why do you wander in the desert?" The traveler swallowed and steadied himself. His voice came out quieter than he intended, but there was honesty in it. I seek nothing but shelter. One night, that is all. After that, I will leave. I do not ask for your company, nor your trust. Only a roof above my head." The giant studied him, his eyes narrowing, reflecting a light that seemed to come from nowhere. There was a tension there, a battle between instinct and restraint. Legends had painted the giant as merciless, a force of nature to be feared. But in that moment, he seemed hesitant, caught off guard by the human before him. "Many have wandered here," the giant said, stepping closer, each movement making the earth beneath tremble slightly. "Most do not survive the desert. Most do not survive me." He paused, letting the words hang in the cavern like a tangible weight. "Yet here you are, alive, humble, honest. Perhaps there is something different about you." The traveler's throat tightened. He did not fully understand what the giant meant, but he sensed a fragile bridge forming between them. Courage, he realized, was not the absence of fear, but the willingness to stand in its presence. He spoke again, voice firmer. "I have nowhere else to go. I only ask for a roof one night. I will honor your generosity. I will not overstay my welcome." The giant tilted his head, studying him as if he were a curious artifact discovered after centuries in the earth. Then, without warning, he extended a massive hand, not to strike, but to point toward a deeper passage in the cavern. "Follow," he commanded. The traveler felt the ground quake underfoot, but the gesture carried no threat. It was the first sign of, perhaps, mercy or curiosity or something that resembled it. As they walked, the traveler noticed the cavern's walls were not natural. Strange etchings, faintly glowing symbols, and carvings of animals long extinct adorned the stone. The giant moved with a fluidity that contradicted his bulk, and the traveler realized that centuries of solitude had honed him into something more than brute strength. He was a sentinel, a keeper of mysteries, and a creature aware of the rare fragility of human life. Finally, they arrived at a corner of the cavern where the fire burned brighter. Here, the traveler could see the giant's abode, rudimentary yet oddly meticulous. Tools lay neatly arranged. Small piles of dried herbs and roots hinted at ancient remedies, and in one corner, a cluster of objects, trinkets, feathers. Bones spoke of a life both long and lonely. "You will sleep here," the giant said, nodding toward a small alcove carved into the rock. "The storm outside will not harm you. But know this, the desert is not the only danger. There are things in this place, things you cannot see, things that may stir." The traveler nodded, his curiosity and fear entwined. He felt the weight of the giant's gaze, and in it, the faintest trace of something unfamiliar, perhaps a longing, perhaps the stirrings of desire, though he could not name it. He had asked for shelter, and he had been granted it, but he could sense that this night would change more than just where he slept, for in the presence of the Apache giant, even a single night could stretch into eternity. The fire crackled softly, throwing long shadows across the walls of the cavern. The traveler sat in the alcove, knees drawn close, feeling the weight of the giant's presence as a tangible pressure in the air. Though the giant had offered shelter, he had not yet spoken more than necessary. The silence between them was thick, filled with unspoken questions and the faint hum of the desert storm outside. The giant, meanwhile, prowled the cavern in slow, deliberate arcs. His massive form moved with surprising grace, hands brushing over shelves of objects, relics, and carvings. To any observer, it might have seemed like simple curiosity, but it was far more complex. He was wrestling with a feeling he had long suppressed, a sensation he did not fully understand. Desire. The mere thought of it was unfamiliar and destabilizing, like stepping onto a cliff whose edges shifted with every heartbeat. Centuries of solitude had taught the giant many things: patience, strength, self-sufficiency. He had faced storms, hunted beasts, and endured the loneliness of a life far longer than any humans. Yet this traveler, small, fragile, mortal, had ignited a spark within him that threatened to unravel his carefully maintained equilibrium. The giant's eyes lingered on the man, noting the subtle tremor in his hands, the tired slump of his shoulders, the quiet dignity in his obedience. Every instinct screamed caution, every lesson whispered to keep distance, yet a strange pull tugged at him, both magnetic and terrifying. He stopped near the traveler's alcove and crouched, lowering his massive frame so that his eyes, deep and stormy, met the human's. "You are far from your home," he rumbled, voice deep enough to vibrate the stones beneath them. "And yet you do not fear me as most do." The traveler shook his head slowly. "Fear is natural, but I have nothing left to lose. And I see now that fear alone cannot protect me, even if I had everything." His voice was soft, honest, and the giant felt an unfamiliar tension in his chest, a reminder of the fragility of life that was both exhilarating and terrifying. The giant's massive hand hovered near the fire, tracing the air as though the flames themselves were fragile threads he might sever with a thought. For centuries, he had kept all living things at arm's length, controlling the space around him with absolute certainty. But now, this human's presence challenged that control. He felt an ache unlike hunger, unlike thirst, unlike fatigue, a yearning for connection, for something he had long denied himself. He turned away, pacing again. The cavern seemed smaller than before, walls pressing in, shadows stretching longer. Desire, he realized, was not a weakness. It was a force he had not reckoned with in centuries, a storm within the storm outside. He questioned his own motives. Was he drawn to the traveler's courage? To his honesty? Or was it something more primal, something raw and dangerous that could consume them both? The giant stopped once more, standing above the traveler, towering like a living mountain. His voice softened almost imperceptibly. "I have given you shelter," he said. "But shelter is not enough. There are consequences to proximity, to trust. Be aware of them. Be aware of me." The traveler nodded, sensing the shift, the fragile boundary between protection and danger. "I am aware," he said, "but I did not come seeking to understand you fully, only to survive the night. If danger is part of that survival, then I will accept it." The giant studied him, and in that moment he realized something profound. The human before him was mortal, fleeting, and fragile. And yet there was courage here that rivaled the storms he had weathered. Wisdom gleaned not from centuries, but from necessity and survival. Desire, dangerous and unpredictable, struck him not as a mere whim, but as a challenge to act, to resist, or to embrace. Each choice carried consequences he had not felt in centuries, and the weight of those choices pressed down upon him heavier than any storm he had endured outside. Finally, he moved away from the fire, retreating to a shadowed corner. He had decided for now that he would not act, not yet. But the pull remained, a subtle tension that threaded through his massive frame, quickening his breath and sharpening his senses. He would sleep, if sleep could come, but he knew that the night had already begun to weave its spell. Desire had struck, subtle but undeniable, and neither the traveler nor the giant would emerge unchanged. Outside, the storm began to wail against the cavern walls. Inside, the giant's heart so long dormant, so carefully guarded, trembled with the first stirrings of a force that would shape the night to come. The storm outside had grown fierce, wind tearing across the desert with a howl that shook the cavern's outer edges. Rain, or what little could be called rain in the arid wasteland, slashed against jagged rocks, sending sprays of sand and dust inside the cavern's mouth. Inside, the traveler huddled in the alcove, watching the shadows dance across the walls as the fire flickered. Each movement of the flames cast the giant's enormous form into a shifting silhouette, monstrous yet strangely human in its contours. For hours, neither spoke. The traveler tried to keep his mind occupied, cataloging the strange objects that lined the cavern. Animal skulls polished smooth, feathers woven into crude talismans, stones etched with markings that hinted at some forgotten language. Every item seemed deliberate, a fragment of the giant's life, and every fragment whispered of centuries spent in solitude. It was a life the traveler could barely imagine, one built on strength, endurance, and unyielding isolation. The giant, meanwhile, moved through the cavern like a shadow with substance. He rearranged stones, adjusted the fire's logs, and occasionally glanced toward the traveler, eyes lingering too long to be casual. Each gaze was heavy with thought, pondering, calculating, wrestling with the storm of unfamiliar feelings that churned within him. Desire, once buried deep beneath layers of discipline and habit, pressed at him like a relentless tide. He remembered the world before isolation, the taste of wind on open plains, the brief encounters with humans who had passed through his territory, the fleeting spark of curiosity, friendship, even affection. Those memories had faded over centuries, buried under the certainty of solitude. But now, the traveler's mere presence rekindled something long dormant, a vulnerability that was both exhilarating and terrifying. The giant paused near the fire, the shadows of his massive frame stretching across the alcove. "You are quiet," he said, his voice low, almost a growl. "Do you not fear me?" The traveler shook his head slowly. "Fear does not help me survive the storm. I am more afraid of the desert than I am of you. And yet, I am aware of you. I know your strength. I know what legends say. But I am not afraid." The giant considered this, his gaze piercing and intense. There was honesty in the traveler's words, a raw simplicity that struck a chord deep within him. Centuries of solitude had left him unprepared for such openness. He had expected fear, flattery, or deception, anything but truth. And now that truth stirred something he had not felt for ages, a desire not born of hunger or instinct, but of recognition, of connection. The storm raged on, shaking the cavern and rattling the walls. The traveler, sensing the giant's internal struggle, remained still, careful not to provoke or intrude. Yet he could feel the tension radiating off the giant like heat from the fire, a coiled energy, immense and dangerous, restrained only by discipline and a faint, trembling curiosity. Hours passed in this uneasy rhythm. The traveler tried to sleep, but found his thoughts constantly drawn to the giant, whose presence dominated the cavern with every subtle motion. The giant, too, struggled with his thoughts. He wanted to turn away, to retreat into the safety of solitude, yet some instinct held him near, tethered to the human by a force he could not name. Desire, he realized, was not merely longing. It was a test of restraint, an illumination of the parts of himself he had hidden even from centuries of silence. Finally, the traveler whispered, breaking the thick, suffocating silence. You do not have to speak if you do not want to. I will not trouble you. I only ask for shelter, not companionship. The giant paused, considering the words. Then, in a voice softer than before, almost inaudible over the storm, he replied, Shelter is not all you bring here. You carry courage. You carry honesty. And you carry something I have not felt in centuries. The traveler nodded, uncertain what the giant meant, but understanding instinctively that some walls, both physical and emotional, were being tested tonight. The fire crackled between them, a fragile barrier against the storm, and the cavern seemed to shrink and expand in tandem with the unspoken tension. Outside, the desert wind screamed and rattled the cavern's mouth, but inside, time moved differently. Every glance, every subtle movement, every unspoken thought deepened the bond of circumstance and curiosity between them. The night had only begun, yet already it promised revelations, confrontations, and the stirring of desires neither of them fully understood, and in the shadows, the giant felt it most sharply, the pull of an emotion so powerful and disorienting that it threatened to undo the careful order of his centuries-long life. Desire had struck, quietly, and the night was only beginning to reveal its consequences. The cavern had grown still, the storm outside now reduced to a whispering drizzle against jagged rock. Inside, only the fire crackled, throwing fleeting shapes across the walls. The traveler had curled up near the alcove, attempting to sleep, but sleep refused him. He could feel the giant's gaze like a weight pressing against his skin, heavy and insistent, aware of every subtle shift of posture, every shallow breath. The giant moved closer, each step deliberate, careful not to shatter the fragile trust that had been established in silence. Centuries of solitude had taught him to keep his desires contained, buried beneath layers of control and discipline. But now, faced with the traveler so small, so mortal, so alive in ways the giant had long forgotten, he felt a stirring he could neither suppress nor fully understand. It began as a flicker, a glance held too long, a hand that hesitated near the traveler's space, a subtle tension that coiled through his massive frame. He had lived through storms and battles, through hunger, thirst, and the unyielding march of time. Yet this subtle pull toward another being was more disorienting than any tempest he had endured. Desire, he realized with a shock, was not just a need but a vulnerability, an awakening of parts of himself that had been locked away for centuries. The traveler shifted, sensing the movement, eyes flicking up to meet the giant's. There was no fear now, only curiosity and a quiet understanding. You are troubled, he whispered, his voice steady despite the tension. Or, "You are something I do not yet know how to read." The giant's gaze lingered, and for the first time he felt a pang of doubt. He had expected solitude, expected the discipline of centuries to guard him against distraction. Yet the human's presence stirred something far older than curiosity, a longing that was both terrifying and intoxicating. He found himself stepping closer, drawn by the warmth of life, the fragility, and the honesty that radiated from the traveler. Desire struck fully in that instant, unbidden and undeniable. It was not mere attraction, nor simple longing. It was a force that made him tremble, even in his enormous form. The cavern seemed smaller, the firelight sharper, the shadows more intimate. He felt a pull toward the traveler that defied reason, that made the walls of his disciplined isolation crumble. The traveler, sensing the shift, remained still, neither retreating nor advancing. "I do not know what you feel," he said softly, "but I can see it. And I do not fear it." His honesty, so simple yet profound, sent another shiver through the giant. This mortal so small, so fragile was the first to meet his desire not with fear, but with quiet recognition. For a long moment, the two were suspended in that tension, a delicate thread stretched taut between them. The giant's chest heaved, massive hands trembling slightly despite his control. Desire had struck him down not with violence, not with conquest, but with the weight of possibility. The knowledge that connection, intimacy, and vulnerability could exist, even here, in the midst of centuries of isolation, shook him to his core. Finally, the giant stepped back, the tremor in his movements betraying his inner struggle. This is dangerous," he admitted, voice low and almost broken by emotion he had long denied. "I am not accustomed to this." The traveler nodded, understanding the confession without words. "Neither am I," he said, "but it is real. And if we ignore it, it does not disappear. It only waits, hidden, to strike again." The giant looked at him, eyes dark with centuries of restraint and the newly awakened storm of desire. For the first time, he acknowledged the truth. He had been struck down, not by a weapon or an enemy, but by an emotion far older than fear, far more potent than time itself. Desire had arrived quietly, like a seed planted in the depths of a long dormant heart, and it was beginning to bloom, untamed and irresistible. Outside, the desert lay quiet, the storm's fury spent, but inside the cavern a far greater tempest raged, one that neither time nor legend could contain. The giant, for the first time in centuries, felt the fragile, exhilarating, terrifying weight of being alive, not merely existing, but feeling, yearning, and facing the truth of desire that could no longer be denied. The night stretched on, the fire casting long, wavering shadows. Desire had struck, and nothing would ever be the same. The cavern felt alive, almost breathing, as though it had absorbed the storm outside and now pulsed with the weight of what had been awakened inside. The traveler sat on the cold stone floor, eyes flicking toward the giant, whose massive form loomed near the fire, tense and restless. Every subtle movement of the giant seemed amplified, a reminder of the power and danger contained within him and of the desire that had struck so suddenly, so completely. Neither spoke for a long while. The silence was not empty. It was heavy with anticipation. A fragile thread stretched taut between two beings who had entered the threshold of something neither fully understood. The traveler's pulse quickened with awareness. He could feel the giant's attention, unwavering and intense, like the heat of the fire pressed against his skin. Every glance carried weight. Every slight shift of posture conveyed meaning. The giant paced slowly, each footfall reverberating through the cavern floor. Centuries of self-discipline clashed violently with the surge of desire coursing through him. He had faced storms, predators, and men alike, Yet none of those challenges had unsettled him as much as the presence of this fragile human. Desire was not a simple thing. It was a force that gnawed at him, unraveling the carefully constructed walls of solitude he had built over lifetimes. "You are bold," the giant said finally, his voice low, rumbling like distant thunder. "You do not fear what most would, yet you walk willingly into it." "Why?" The traveler met his gaze without flinching. "I do not ask for fear to guide me. I ask for honesty. You have offered me shelter, and I am grateful. Beyond that, I do not know what is expected of me, but I will not pretend to be something I am not." The giant paused, a massive hand hovering near the fire, tracing the air as though to hold back the flames themselves. The honesty in the traveler's words struck him harder than he expected. Desire had shown him a vulnerability long denied, yet it also carried the terrifying possibility of loss, betrayal, or failure. He could not afford recklessness, not with this being, not with the fragile trust he had already begun to respect, and yet every instinct screamed to act. The firelight danced across the giant's features, revealing the conflict in his eyes, centuries of strength and solitude battling the raw, unfamiliar need to reach out, to connect, to acknowledge the stirrings of desire that had claimed him. His massive chest heaved, breaths shallow but deliberate, as he measured the risk of stepping closer, of allowing the pull of his emotions to dominate logic. The traveler shifted slightly, sensing the tension. "I do not fully understand what is happening between us," he admitted quietly, "but I feel it, and I am aware of it. You do not have to act on it, yet neither can you ignore it. It exists, and it will not vanish." The giant's gaze softened momentarily, and he nodded, acknowledging the truth in the traveler's words. The tension in the cavern tightened like a drawn bowstring. Desire had emerged fully now, unbidden and unstoppable, but the giant's centuries of discipline demanded restraint. He could crush this human with a single gesture, or he could do nothing and allow the fragile thread between them to fray or perhaps strengthen. Each second stretched painfully. The traveler's presence was a reminder of mortality, fragility, and honesty, all of which the giant had long avoided confronting. And yet, the very fragility he had once scorned now drew him in, making the desire sharper, more insistent. The weight of possibility pressed upon him. To act might bring fulfillment, yet also risk destruction. To restrain might protect, yet leave the longing unquenched, simmering for centuries more. The fire flickered and cast a shadow across the giant's massive frame, highlighting the tension coiled in his posture. He could feel the storm inside himself rivaling the one outside the cavern earlier. Desire had become not just a feeling, but a force that demanded choice, action, or restraint. And in that moment, he understood that the night ahead would not merely be about shelter. It would be about reckoning with the force that had struck him down, reshaping both him and the traveler in ways neither could yet anticipate. The traveler, aware of the gaze and weight upon him, did not move or speak further. He waited, silently acknowledging the danger, the power, and the possibility of what might come. The tension in the cavern reached its peak, the air thick with unspoken truths, fragile trust, and the intoxicating pull of desire. Outside, the desert lay quiet under a canopy of stars, unaware of the storm that raged within the cavern. And inside, both the giant and the traveler knew, instinctively and unavoidably, that nothing about this night would remain simple or unchanged. The fire had burned low, leaving the cavern dimly lit, shadows stretching long and uncertain across the walls. Outside, the desert was calm, the storm spent, leaving only the whisper of wind brushing over sand. Inside, however, the tension was suffocating, thick as stone, pressing on the traveler and the giant alike. The giant stood above the traveler, immense and imposing, yet trembling in ways that his sheer size could not hide. Desire had struck him down, unraveling the careful restraint he had built over centuries. Every instinct in him, the caution, the discipline, the fear of vulnerability, now battled with the longing that surged through his massive frame. "You must leave," the giant finally said, voice low and strained, almost breaking under the weight of unspoken emotion. I cannot risk what you awaken in me. It is too much, too dangerous." The traveler did not move, though his pulse raced. "Leave?" he asked softly. "Do you mean now? Or do you mean forever?" The giant's stormy eyes met the traveler's unwavering gaze, and for the first time he allowed himself to see clearly not just the mortal before him, but the fragile, fleeting life that dared to look into the abyss of his centuries and remain unafraid. The ache in his chest deepened. He wanted to reach out, to bridge the impossible distance between them, but fear gripped him as tightly as desire. One wrong gesture could destroy the fragile trust that had formed in mere hours. "You do not understand," the giant said, almost pleading, his deep voice vibrating through the cavern walls. "I have lived centuries in solitude. I have survived storms, enemies, hunger, and time itself. But this desire, this connection, it is chaos I'm not prepared to face." The traveler rose slowly, knees creaking, and stepped closer, heart pounding but eyes steady. "I understand more than you think," he whispered. "I feel it too. But it is not chaos. It is life. It is the only thing that proves we are not merely shadows of ourselves. You fear it, yes, but you cannot deny it either." For a long moment, the giant remained still, massive form frozen, torn between centuries of caution and the irresistible pull of something raw and human. Desire had struck him down, yes, but it also demanded acknowledgement, demanded a choice. Every heartbeat thundered in his chest, every breath a reminder of the precarious balance he now faced. Then, instinct and emotion collided. The giant knelt slightly, lowering himself so that his vast form was not as overwhelming, but still larger than life. His hand hovered near the traveler, trembling not in malice, but in awe and uncertainty. If I reach toward you, I risk everything," he admitted, voice thick with vulnerability. "But to deny it, to deny this, would be to destroy what little remains of me that remembers how to feel." The traveler's hand hovered in return, almost touching, almost bridging the impossible gap between mortal and legend. "Then choose," he said softly, "not with fear or caution, but with what is true. Whatever happens, we face it together." And in that instant, the giant's inner storm reached its apex. Desire and fear collided, creating a tension so intense it seemed to warp the very air of the cavern. Shadows flickered violently in the low firelight as if the walls themselves were trembling in anticipation. The giant's breath quickened, his massive frame coiled like a spring ready to uncoil, and yet he paused, suspended between restraint and surrender. The choice hung in the air, a delicate thread stretched to its breaking point. One movement would decide everything: trust or retreat, connection or isolation, the fragile possibility of something more or the crushing weight of centuries of solitude. Time slowed. The fire crackled. The shadows danced. And in that fragile, suspended moment, both the traveler and the giant understood the truth. Nothing about this night, nothing about this encounter would ever remain unchanged. Desire had struck, yes, but it was not the end. It was the beginning of something neither of them could yet name, a force that demanded courage, honesty, and the willingness to face the unknown together. The cavern held its breath. Dawn crept slowly across the desert, pale light spilling into the cavern and scattering the shadows that had clung so stubbornly through the night. The storm had long since passed, leaving a world washed clean, quiet, and infinite. Inside, the fire had dwindled to glowing embers, the flickering warmth casting long, soft shadows across the walls. The traveler stirred, stretching cramped limbs, and found himself alone, at least at first glance. The giant remained nearby, massive form coiled in the darkness like a sentinel, eyes fixed on the flickering embers. Yet there was something different in his gaze. No longer was it merely caution or curiosity. It carried a weight of acknowledgement of something raw and human, of something awakened by the night's events. The traveler rose fully, brushing dust from his cloak, and met the giant's eyes. "You could have ignored me," he said quietly. "You could have turned me away as your legends promise. But you did not." The giant's voice rumbled softly, almost more to himself than to the traveler. "I could not," he admitted. "I have lived centuries in solitude, surviving storms, enemies, and time itself. But to see you, to feel what I felt, it is impossible to forget. Desire struck me, yes, but it also reminded me of who I was, and who I might still be." The traveler stepped closer, tentative but steady. "And what now?" he asked. "Do we part, as the world expects, or do we remain in this place, however briefly, and see what it brings?" The giant looked down at him, massive hands resting lightly on stone. For the first time, he allowed himself a small, almost imperceptible smile, a crack in the armor of centuries. "We cannot stay here forever," he said. "The desert is vast, and your path will take you onward. But the night has changed something. And perhaps it is enough that we remember it, carry it forward in ways we cannot yet see." The traveler nodded, understanding that this encounter, brief as it had been, was already permanent in its impact. He had sought only a roof for one night, and yet he had found something far more elusive, the rare recognition of a being who had lived for centuries, whose heart had been locked away, and whose desire had finally been awakened, not in conquest, but in the fragile acknowledgement of life, mortality, and truth. The giant shifted, standing taller now, imposing as ever, yet less distant, less untouchable. "Remember," he said, voice low, "desire is a force, yes, but it is not a weakness. It is proof that we are alive, that we are capable of feeling even when the world would strip us of it. Do not fear it, traveler. And do not forget that even giants, even those who seem invincible, can be struck down by it." The traveler hesitated, then smiled softly. "I will remember, and I will carry the memory of this night with me. Perhaps it is not the end, but a beginning." The giant nodded once, solemnly, as the first rays of sun touched the cavern floor. Outside, the desert glimmered with the quiet beauty of a new day, wind smoothing the sand into gentle curves, sunlight glinting off distant rocks like scattered gems. Life went on, vast and eternal, yet both the traveler and the giant knew that within this fleeting encounter, something extraordinary had taken root. With a final glance, the traveler turned toward the cavern's mouth, toward the path that would take him onward. The giant remained behind, a silent guardian, his massive frame blending with the shadows, yet forever marked by the spark of connection that had awakened him. Desire had struck him down, yes, but it had also awakened the possibility, a reminder that even in solitude one could still feel, still hope, still be changed. And as the traveler disappeared into the sunlit expanse, the giant exhaled a breath he had not realized he had been holding. The desert stretched endlessly, vast and empty, yet somehow less lonely. One night, one fleeting encounter, had shifted the currents of time and heart alike. The roof that had been requested for one night had become a threshold into desire, into understanding, into the quiet, enduring possibility of life beyond solitude. He only asked for a roof for one night, and in return they had both been struck down and forever awakened.